The Stink is a season 6 episode, the first season 6 episode actually of Gumball that I've reviewed thus far. Regardless of your opinion of the season as a whole, I enjoyed a lot of these episodes that are quite underrated. This episode isn't your most comedy-driven episode, but I really thought it's a good example on how you don't just need to use stellar jokes to carry a story, but enhance it and defines one of the characters as a pretty toxic person. Before we go further, I would like to highlight that when I refer to toxic people, I'm referring to people who are over the top about claiming every little thing they do affects the world, and if you aren't on their side, you're pretty much against them. I wasn't able to find there's an actual definition for a person like this, but this of course can diverge into various topics far past global warming as this episode includes, such as politics and stuff, but I'm not here to talk about that. I mean, for most people it's pretty obvious, but you can't just force others to have the same opinions and practices as you and expect them to cooperate with you or respect you. I think this episode of Gumball is one of the best examples of how to portray someone who's not necessarily in the wrong in terms of their morals, but undermines their whole side they are trying to stand for by being toxic. With this long disclaimer out of the way, let's start the review. The episode starts with Gumball and Darwin complaining about the complications of recycling, which summons Mr. Small here like a spider fainting in Super Autopets. Of course, for longtime fans, most people know Mr. Small is the vegan trope in the show. There are countless of times where Mr. Small's calmness and nature are joked upon in the show, only with the good spirits of course. And here he's trying to convince the kids to recycle more. And here is where we get to fully grasp the center attention of the episode. We know recycling is good for the environment, so here there's a different focus on the episode over the message of recycling.
Just use recycled paper, okay?
Who wants to use something that's already been used? Isn't it weird making new stuff out of old stuff?
With today's sophisticated recycling techniques, you can reuse old stuff and most people can never tell the difference.
Nah, I think it looks cheap.
Yes, this episode is to clown on Mr. Small, and I'll get to why in a bit, why he resembles someone who may be considered toxic. Reusing Mr. Small from the first season was ingenious. Love the fourth wall break that Gumball is of course known for. And Gumball retorts Mr. Small's claim to add conflict to the conversation, which excels the story. Mr. Small goes on to say that people who say things along the lines of, "We won't be alive in a few years, so why bother?" or "We can't move on to the next planet, so why bother as well," are the reason things like the stink ape go extinct. We'll see later that the stink ape is just the illusion of Bigfoot here, but it quite honestly just is the weakest point here, but I digress. But then, Gumball claims Mr. Small is being a hypocrite. As while yes, everything he says would be a dream come true, but isn't an implausible reality, and putting himself on this podium is pretty much a selfish act. And in this case, I completely agree with Gumball for once in my life here. Everything Mr. Smalls has said thus far is nothing controversial. It's a typical understanding that helping the planet is a good thing. But he undermines all of this, everything he said thus far, by just saying this one little line.
Everything you do has an impact on something.
Not me. Come walk a mile in my sandals, I'll show you.
I don't think those things will last a mile, but whatever.
This completely is where Mr. Small loses me, and Gumball as well. I'm not speaking for everyone of course, but in the setting of Gumball where the town resembles a somewhat modern day with how materialistic the society is, Mr. Small isn't anything special. He has a job, he needs food on his stomach, he needs clothes on his back, just like everyone else in the show. Claiming he is this unspoken deity where everything he has done has positively affected the earth is preposterous, and I really do hope no one in the real world thinks this way as well. Of course, this can diverge into other categories of debates as I previously mentioned, and I think Mr. Small is a great example of toxic people here. He spends only a little time to end up disproving his own point and completely turns around and falls onto Gumball's side. Luckily, Mr. Small here is a pretty civil and calm person in which he does not go to this complete rage mode when he's proven wrong. So he's not exactly a toxic person, but he has the traits of a toxic person, which is what I want to highlight. So for instance, if this was anyone else, just think for a minute, could this have gone differently? Instead of Mr. Small running into the woods trying to make up for what he's done, if this was in a real world scenario, what would have they done? Or if this was you in this scenario, would you just leave or continue berating Gumball here? It's just food for thought. Anyways, with how extreme of course Mr. Small is, he ends up detesting himself and spends time in nature to find a place in himself where he is satisfied with his actions that he's committed thus far. We've seen how bad nature can be in Elmore in episodes such as The Picnic, and Mr. Small is eaten literally alive. There is nothing wrong with Mr. Small's actions here. He just wants to meet a state where he is more satisfied with, and that's okay, there's nothing wrong with that. As long as he's in his own bubble, there is nothing wrong here. And this is why Mr. Small is a great character to compare himself to, is because he isn't perceived to be an awful person, nor is his beliefs wrong. He just didn't put any effort into self-assessing himself when pledging to his cause, as he was opposing people that were imposing him. Those people who don't stay in their own bubble or aren't bitter about getting their point across are toxic people. They are perceived to be this way because of the ill way they handle interactions. But in contrast here, Mr. Small is a kind-hearted person and yet is still considered to be wrong. That's the purpose behind including Mr. Small here and why it works so dang well. Worried about Mr. Small's well-being, Gumball and Darwin scout for him the next day in the woods, expecting him to be there. After a passable chase, Mr. Small is glad that the boys went out to help him, and insists that, yeah, nature isn't as pretty as he made it out to be. Love the added part of Gumball also accepting Mr. Small's views after living in the woods. They even managed to add a vegan joke, which actually has some science behind it, but I digress. They meet the infamous Stink Ape, but accidentally send him down one of Mr. Small's traps. Here, Mr. Small fully acknowledges that he was doing less damage in the modern world than he was living in the forest. They exchange one final conversation if he'll return to school, and he kindly accepts it. And with that, that was the Stink. To reiterate, Mr. Small works great here on defining the imbalance of how toxic people can be perceived. At the end, he acknowledges that at the end of the day, he's going to be affecting something regardless of his actions, and being aware of this is more positive than it's credited for. He accepts his faults and manages to learn something from the situation, which again is a positive lesson to engage the viewers into. Being more positive here doesn't completely get the more realistic approach to people like this, but hopefully if someone acts this way in the spur of the moment, as Mr. Small did, they'll apologize and be more accepting of other people's beliefs and not berating them for just being different. And in the end, I really liked this thing. I thought it was a pretty good episode. While there was a little bit of jokes and the story was pretty bleh, the morals of Mr. Small specifically was really good. And the episode spends a lot of time critiquing something that I really do agree with. Thanks for watching, guys. Hopefully this video was something insightful. Hope you guys have a good rest of your day, and I'll catch you next week.